Hello, Isaac.
Rabbi, good evening. How are you?
I'm doing phenomenally.
Well, the high point of my day are our discussions on the Gospel of Matthew. So looking forward to it.
Amazing. Okay, so let's get started. I think we're up to 3-4. We just finished our favorite Isaiah prophecy fulfillment slash prophecy.
Yeah. The Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 3, verse 4. Now John wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist, and his food was locust and wild honey.
Wow. Okay, so this is like very, very specific, right? So we didn't know in the wilderness where he was at all. We thought it's Perea, which is based on Luke. It's in Jordan today, but now we get into very, very deep details. He wore camel's hair, a belt, and his food was locusts and wild honey. So what do you take of this?
So
Why do we care about this, Isaac?
So this confirms that he lived in the desert, that he didn't move back and forth, like he slept and he preached in the desert. He lived a very, very simple life. I mean, simple as in, wild honey. He ate wild honey and locust, and his clothing was very simple. So the fact that the evangelist wants us to know that he wore this and he ate this, right? What was he? What do you want his readers to understand from this? Like, what is the value in telling us what John ate and what he wore?
So, I mean, the very simple. So I want to go into detail of each of these things,
Yeah.
but before we go into detail, the obvious connection is trying to make in 2 Kings 1:8. It describes how Elijah the prophet dressed, and this is similar to Elijah the prophet, which in Malachi in 4:5 is prophesied to come to be, as we talked about, a Messiah, the son of Joseph, or an Elijah the prophet, or a herald of Jesus.
So was John the Baptist viewed as Elijah in the new form?
So 100% the New Testament wants us to think that based
Yeah.
on this. So for example, just to read you 2 Kings 1:8, he had a garment of hair and a leather belt around his waist. And the king said,
Kings
that is
1.
Elijah the Tishbit. So it's very clear that we're trying to make that connection. So the question, as a good reader of the New Testament, we should very quickly ask, every single other New Testament fulfillment and or observation was in order to kind of like bring it back to the Old Testament. But over here, it really isn't cited as much. It just kind of says this, that by the way, he wore this and he ate this. And if this is meant to connect to Malachi and to 2 Kings 1:8, it's surprising that it doesn't say that this is connected. It could be that was so obviously not a prophecy that they couldn't say that as, oh, and this is in order to fulfill. But let's be honest, you and I have felt on multiple occasions that other examples also were not prophecy fulfillments and yet are listed as prophecy fulfillments. So it's interesting the parallel that clearly Elijah, by wearing camel's hair and having a leather girdle, is meant to be Elijah.
So
No.
okay, so what is the significance of Elijah to Judaism? Like of all.
Elijah's the guy who's always coming back. The reason Elijah is so special is because when you look at the way he died in 2 Kings,
Mhm,
it doesn't actually say he died. It says he went up in a fiery chariot. And
mhm.
there's a big argument regarding what does it mean to go up in a fiery chariot. If Isaac goes up to heaven in a fiery chariot, it means that Isaac's body is burnt and he goes and joins God as a dead person. But another way to look at it is that if God wants to make a fiery chariot that doesn't burn, God can make a fiery chariot that doesn't burn. So when he goes up to heaven, he doesn't die, and he's viewed as this almost Santa Claus figure that
Yeah.
keeps coming to the Jewish people throughout history. And there's thousands of examples, even when we look at as late as 17th century responsa, we'll find examples of, well, maybe that was Elijah. And I've heard stories growing up. I literally went to Englewood maybe 2 months ago to hear a music show at one of the synagogues, and the rabbi told a story, and that, oh, it was Elijah coming to his house. This is a rabbi today in 2020, or I guess, yeah, 2020, not 2021, but 2020, telling that story. So Elijah is the guy who keeps coming, and that's based on Malachi. Malachi 4:5 mentions that.
So when you say coming in what way? Like,
To
when we discuss.
herald the Messiah.
Yeah. So when we discussed a couple of weeks ago, we saw Jesus as a form of new Moses, as in the parallels between the life of Jesus and Moses, to say, so we had Moses in the Torah, he's somebody who's bigger than Moses. So, and now we have Elijah, as in John the Baptist is symbolic of Elijah, or Elijah
Well,
in the
again,
flesh
don't
and
forget
blood.
Elijah in Malachi 4:5. Just read the verse. Behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So if you're mentioning the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God is coming, Elijah is supposed to be the precursor based on a literal interpretation of Malachi 4:5. And don't
Yeah.
forget, for Jewish readers, Malachi is the last of the Old Testament of the Bible books. So this is the last communication where we could be sure that God is foretelling the future, that this guy will come. So just like we said that Jesus could be Emmanuel, obviously there's no problem imagining it could be like this. The better question is that, were people expecting Elijah literally, as I gave you an example of how commentators could read it as Elijah and Elijah will come? Or is it that it's obvious that it was meant to be a different person, and John the Baptist can fulfill the definition of Elijah? And it's really interesting as we go in and out of literal translations and literal interpretations of these texts. Because I would have thought like Elijah, the person, but it almost feels like Elijah now is a concept that has to be fulfilled.
So, was John the Baptist, was he aware that was he aware that he's a form of Elijah? People viewed him as Elijah, or is it just the evangelist kind of picked out his food to say he ate this food, as in to draw this parallelism? So the question is,
Yeah, your question's so strong that you can even make it a little bit stronger by saying that, does Elijah want to be Elijah, or does Elijah want to be the King David's scion? The Elijah guy, it just sounds like, is the throwaway. As I keep mentioning, the idea of the Messiah, the son of Joseph, which is his precursor. So you don't want to be the Elijah, you want to be the king. You want to be the prophet. Yeah. So the question is, was John the Baptist, foretelling, when we talk about King of Heaven, a time of a Davidic dynasty retaking over, in which case he himself would have no problem identifying with this Elijah figure? Or was he kind of saying, as we keep talking about this idea of the awesome day, the day of God, of a total upheaval, and for all we know, maybe that was an upheaval also of the Davidic dynasty from John's perspective?
Now, it's interesting, right? Like, we don't know anything about John the Baptist, as in how did he come to view him? How did he come to view himself as Elijah? Or
Well, we're
what
not saying
led
he
him?
did, right? We're saying the possibility. As we know, we don't know how he viewed himself. Like the one historical account, I mean, we have several, but the one historical account we have of him, we do have the text of how Josephus called him, and we know that he was specifically important from a Josephus perspective too. Like, in other words, like, even without the New Testament, we would have known that John the Baptist was a person who was killed, who was busy during the first century because of the text of Josephus, even without Mark or Matthew or Luke or John mentioning John.
Now, these food, right, locust and wild honey, is it kosher food? I mean, is he?
A great question. So the answer is locusts are, there is a brand, there's a species of locust that's kosher. And generally people, when they read this, they assume that it is the kosher version, and wild honey is kosher. What's special about it is that today, for example, Jews don't eat locusts as a general law, because there's another verse in the Bible that says you shouldn't eat anything that's repugnant. So just because something is allowed doesn't mean you should do it. And generally, locust is viewed as repugnant. But I've heard of certain people eating locusts. But there's no doubt that the locust would have been the bottom of the barrel. This is like, I don't know if it's called an ascetic if you eat junk. Ascetic is someone who doesn't eat, or someone who kind of sucks on a fig seed all day. I don't know. So this is like so much past. This is like, it's a level past ascetic. I don't know what to call it. It's like the crazy level where you're like, whatever I find in the God, whatever is a gift to me from God, I will eat. And you know what you don't find on the street? You don't find deer just coming into your home to let you eat, unless you're Elijah. Elijah did so I feel like this is the bottom of the barrel. The wild honey, like, where do you find wild honey? So in the olden, like, for example, when we say the land of Israel is flowing with milk and honey, what do we mean by that? Have you heard that phrase? The land of Israel.
Yeah.
So flowing with milk generally means goat milk,
Mm-hmm.
because there's not so many cows floating around there. And then honey, we generally do not mean bee honey. We mean date honey, which is, especially near Jericho and the Dead Sea area, especially where they were, dates would have been very, very prevalent.
Yeah.
But they probably would have been also, again, I don't know the difference between private property versus commercial property versus mass-produced property in the first century of dates. But, even recently, they found a bag of dates from the first century. I don't know if you saw this in the news, and they planted it, and they actually were able to plant a now extinct form of dates from 2,000 years ago. So dates were common then, and they'd smash it and make date honey. But date honey is something that is not as easily accessible. That's a processed food. So I view the locust and date honey as almost opposites. I almost feel that it feels like it should be bee honey, because bee honey, you see bears, kind of stick your hand in, you try not to get stung. But date honey is more of a processed thing. Otherwise, it's just in dates. So I feel like this is a little bit more contradictory in the nature of what what the New Testament, what the evangelist is trying to tell us about Matthew here. And I'm not sure what to
Yeah.
take
About John the Baptist. How about John the Baptist here? So this is what the evangelist wants us to know about John the Baptist, right?
Yes.
That he ate the locust and wild honey.
And again, I think the most important point, obviously, is that it's public foods. He wasn't going to the supermarket.
Yeah, and it's not fully kosher, or we don't know.
Again, I'm saying that it is fully kosher.
What kind of person would this be? I mean, every day or most days to eat this, he'd have been in a wild. I mean, I don't use the word wild.
Well, even I'll be honest. Like, have you ever, I'm no expert in hair, but I will say in the olden days it was much more common to be wearing wool, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the difference in I felt camel hair, and it is soft, I guess, when it's washed. A lot of times when people buy citrons for the holiday of Sukkot for booths, they buy an etrog, they wrap it in camel hair. That's how, so I've had a lot of camel hair in my life in that one instance of wrapping that. But a lot of times it has to be washed, and I don't think camel hair is as comfortable. I think camel hair is special in this situation, and that he probably would have been able to collect camel hair for free. I think a person can't access wool. If you say, I want wool from a sheep, you're not just going to pull it off. You see, they always have to.
It's a process involved.
Yeah. So I think camel hair would have been at least free. But again, like, I don't see John the Baptist kind of like, I don't know if you ever see this picture of Adam and Eve kind of like sewing the fig leaf together. Like, I don't really see the idea of John sewing the camel hair together and a leather belt. Again, like, it's something he would have had to get. So I view the first two, camel hair and leather belts, as specific to parallel Elijah. But it's surprising to me that it uses the word camel specifically. But I guess that's just something that they would have had access to.
So would John the Baptist, would he have been unique in this lifestyle, or do you think there was a community around him, there were people like him who probably lived like this, and he was just one among
Well, that's
them?
a good question. We do know there are ascetic communities, and I mean, on top of that question, let's imagine he was the only one, even though we know there's other poor people in ascetics. Was he, another question we asked is, was he advocating this lifestyle? Was he just preaching from, like, a lot of times when someone's ascetic, like, the best example is a priest, a father, a Catholic father. He'll say, I don't have sex, but you shouldn't live like me. I'm living this different kind of existence. The question was John bifurcating his reality, and that there's you who have to be like this, or is me? Is it that everyone who wants to be part of the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be like this? Or is he trying to be like Elijah? Because nowhere do we see Elijah, like the first two you could say are Elijah parallels, camel hair and leather belt, but we can't say that the food was Elijah parallel. We don't really see this as an Elijah parallel.
So what do you think? Was John the Baptist saying that you should do this like me, or was he modeling his lifestyle around the kingdom of heaven and saying this is how people should live, or it was just his
I think that, whenever you have John was a charismatic leader. Whenever you have a charismatic leader, there's always identity issues about them that are very interesting. It's very rare to have a charismatic leader who doesn't dress a certain way, have a certain haircut. So the fact that he had idiosyncratic elements.
Yeah. Now, wouldn't you say that almost every prophet in the Old Testament was a charismatic leader? Like, is there anyone in the Old Testament? I mean, when I mean a leader in the Old Testament who's not charismatic? You take Moses.
So that's a great question. Is it, to be a prophet, does one have to be a charismatic leader? I don't know. It's a good question. When we talk about prophecy,
Jesus by all definition was charismatic. Paul
definitely. John, Jesus, and Paul are some charismatic folk.
Peter was charismatic too.
Yeah, I'm agreeing. I'm just saying, like, when I think of charismatic Christians, I think John, Jesus, and Paul go to the
Mhm,
top of my list.
mhm.
And also that mega church guy today. I forgot his name. You ever watch him? He's all he wins. He rakes in the money.
I
Seems
know.
charismatic. Has a big church.
Well, there are quite a few like him. I mean, it's not
Okay, I'm just saying you can only do
pathetic.
that if you're a charismatic leader.
Yeah.
Charismatic. I was actually listening to a video today about charismatic leaders, and they're saying one thing that a charismatic leader does is they take note of their crowd.
Yeah.
They see that their crowd is
Mhm.
able to kind of cheer on certain points and don't cheer on other points, and they can lean into the points they're cheering on. It could be that John's message of the kingdom of heaven being around the corner only makes sense if you're visiting the world from a non-physical perspective.
Yeah.
A physical perspective, even though Jesus is the physical incarnate and all that, but the more you focus on the physical, it's hard to imagine how the godly elements are intertwined and interweaved with the physical elements. The more he probably refrained, abstained, took the physicality out of his life, it's probably easier for him to make the argument that the kingdom of heaven is around the corner. One of the famous questions is, does Jesus need to have kids? If someone believes that the kingdom of heaven is around the corner, should you have kids? I don't. Why? What's the point of having kids? If the whole point of having kids is like to kind of repopulate the world to keep going. But if we're at the end of times, we don't need to have kids.
Okay. On that note, maybe this might be a good place to start. This might be a good
Yeah.
place to stop, Rabbi. And so we've ushered the kingdom of heaven. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and look
Okay.
forward to
Thank
this
you.
tomorrow. Thank